But this book, I will suggest to you, would be very helpful to young people, especially young people who may not be living in the kind of setting that they would wish might change. If you happen to read the book, or if you meet someone who will have read it, you will learn that I grew up in poverty. And so I learned very early how important education happens to be, because I had two remarkable parents. Father who had a third grade education, lost his arm just above his left elbow before I was born, and a mother who had a high school diploma. They made it very clear to me at a very early age that I was going to go to college. They never set foot on a college campus, couldn't tell me what I should think about majoring in, let alone where I should consider going to college. But they also made it very plain to me that I needed to get the best grades that I could to give me the opportunity to earn the right to go to college. It also meant, I found out later, that teachers were always right. We did not have a telephone for a long while, but somehow they seemed to find out if somehow I might not have done everything correct in school that day, but they heard about it, and I felt it when I got home. So I learned at a very early age to make sure that I do everything the best that I know how. The second thing I would say is that for anyone who has an interest in wanting to run for political office, this book would be very helpful to anyone with that kind of interest. Because as a person, if you read the book, you will learn that in order to get ready to run against a living legend, in this case Coleman Alexander Young, who was mayor of the city of Detroit, for the great things that he did, how much people loved him and the like, you just can't step up to the microphone and say, my name is, and this is what I've done, and I'd like to be your next mayor. You better come with something that would cause people to believe in what you want to do. You open them up or give them an opportunity to respond to what you suggest in hopes that they may not only believe and agree, but come up with even better suggestions that you might have. So that is what you will find overall in this book. I graduated from Cassopolis High School in 1959, and I went to Wayne State University. Had a lot of jobs. I've been working since I've been 8 years old. I've been a caddy on a golf course. I swept and mopped the floor, bakery floor. I worked in a gentleman's basement where he did a lot of metal design work that he would take to Chicago and sell to an interior decorator. I worked in a furniture factory for about 2 weeks before they found out I lied about my age and they put me out. And then I went to work for a real estate company in the city of Detroit where I painted houses, and that was back in the day when they had oil paint. And anybody who's ever painted with oil paint inside, especially if you happen to be painting closets, you know how tight it can be and what it smells like. And then, of course, if you got on the ladder and painted eaves trough, the paint would come down your arm. I mean, I've done it all. But I enjoyed having graduated from Western Michigan University with a degree in education. Western Michigan University has an outstanding track record for training people who want to be teachers. And I graduated and started teaching learning disabled students in the city of Detroit. I really enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed working with my students. I enjoyed working with the teachers. my principal, Violet Barty, she said, you ought to think about becoming a principal. But if you want to become a principal, you've got to get a master's degree. So I was encouraged by that. I went to the Rackham Building downtown in Detroit, or Midtown Detroit. It's right across the street from the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I enrolled in 2 classes. The 2 textbooks that I used as I got home, I said, well, they look awful familiar. And as I started looking through them, I said, I had these same 2 textbooks when I was going to Western Michigan. Why am I taking these same 2 classes? And to get a master's degree too. I mean, so I was dating this teacher. And I said, what's this all about? I said, I don't even understand this. What am I supposed to learn new? And so after, I guess she got tired of my whining or complaining, she would say, what do you think about going to law school? I said, I don't know any lawyers. I don't know anybody in the legal profession, never been in a lawyer's office, don't know what they do. The more I complained, the more she said, you ought to go to law school. So I took the LSAT test. I got the kind of grade back or score that suggested that if I went to law school, because nobody promises you anything, if I went to law school, that if I studied hard, I could perhaps graduate from law school. And if I graduated from law school, then perhaps I would be able to pass the bar. And if I passed the bar, then maybe I might be able to be a good lawyer. Well, I started law school, fell in love with the law, and I recalled the conversations in the student union at Wayne State in Western Michigan about issues that were going on around in the country. When I grew up, we didn't have a television. I was the only child. We were so poor, we couldn't pay attention. So we didn't get a television until my uncle brought a black and white television to Cassopolis from Detroit. Dad went to the store that sold the antennas, he put one on our roof, ran it down to the TV. And I recall watching television and seeing and reading about Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I started seeing how people were treated with hoses and how dogs would come after them and the like. Now this is back in high school. And as I'm learning the law, I begin to appreciate the power and the majesty of what a lawyer can do to help people in need. I never thought about being a judge, as my friend Judge Art Bothwell, who was in the audience, who's a former Berrien County Circuit Court judge and also a president of the State Bar of Michigan. But after about my second year or so in law school, I did the wisest thing I think that I have ever done. I proposed to the teacher who suggested that I ought to go to law school. We've been married 50 years. We'll be celebrating our 51st on June 17th. Trudy Ann, why don't you stand up? I graduated from law school, but before I graduated, I knew I needed a job. I'd had a chance to work for Judge, well, he was not a judge. It was a year that he was appointed by United States Senator Phil Hart. He nominated Damon J. Keith to serve on the Eastern District of Michigan. And I clerked in his firm as a really more of a gopher because I didn't know that much, but I enjoyed it because one of the things that happened in the city of Detroit in 1967 was that we had a rebellion that wound up with over 40 people killed and over 7,000 people arrested and housed on Bill Isle in Detroit. And I watched on television, read the newspapers, and listened to judges as they call for lawyers did not matter whether you had a practice in criminal law, real estate, or whatever the case may be. They needed to be able to get these 7,200 people who were arrested before them so that they would know as a defendant what they were charged with and set bonds so that they could either be free on bond or be further incarcerated. That was a real learning experience, and the lawyers that participated did such a fine and admirable job. The following year, Donald Campbell, who started as a law professor the same semester that I started as a student at Detroit College of Law, called me in his office and said, "We just got a telephone call from the general counsel at Ford Motor Company. And Ford Motor Company wanted to make a statement to let everybody know that they were going to be an equal opportunity employer. And they encourage law schools to recommend somebody to come and be a summer associate for the summer. And he suggested that I ought to do that. I did it. Fabulous. Just from somebody who grew up in Cassopolis, Michigan, with a population of 1,200, with the largest graduation class of 79, it was a rare treat, and I learned a lot that summer. But here I am, I'm getting ready to look for a job so I can become a lawyer once I graduate and pass the bar. My father-in-law, Jim Duncombe, suggested that I should meet and see about working for a lawyer that he knew. They both served in the Army together. His name was Robert Millender. Robert Millender was running the campaign for Richard Austin, who was running for mayor. His opponent, as it turned out, in the general election was Ray Gribbs, who was a former Wayne County sheriff. On a very close election, Ray Gribbs won. And the reason why I wanted to work in the campaign was I figured that if Robert Millender saw me work real hard, and I did, and there was a lot of things that I did to help on the campaign, and started moving up and started leading the advance team where we'd go out before the candidate would come. Richard Austin would drive up with the driver, et cetera, and I'd tell him who was in the audience, where somebody might be asking a lot of tough questions, where they sat, et cetera, and then I went to the next place. He lost the election. I didn't get the job, but I fell in love with politics because I began to appreciate exactly what politics could do if you got the right people in office who had those who they wanted to serve in mind, and if they were ethical and hardworking, how they could change the lives for the better for people they served. So over the next several years, I ran and got involved in a lot of election campaigns for judges, members of Congress, governor, U.S. senators, county executives, et cetera. Along the way, I became president of the Wolverine Bar, the National Bar, and the State Bar of Michigan. In 1985, as I was finishing up my year of service as president of the State Bar, Governor James Blanchard reached out to me and asked if I would serve on the Michigan Supreme Court. We'd not had a person of color serving on the Michigan Supreme Court for about 20 years. Otis Smith was the very first. Indeed, it was Otis Smith and Damon J. Keith that Phil Hart had to choose between as to who he was going to nominate to the president to serve on the federal district court in the city of Detroit, the trial court. And he chose Damon Keith. Well, don't think that Otis Smith lost, because Otis Smith became the first vice president and general counsel of General Motors, an African American, first time. And that was just outstanding and the like. So they both went on to become giants. I ran to keep my seat in 1986. I was all over the state, but that was the second time because as president of the State Bar of Michigan, I've been all over the state. There were organizations that I did not know existed, service organizations that did so much for their respective communities. But because I'd had a chance to meet so many wonderful lawyers all across Michigan, they were very helpful and asked me to come to speak to their bar association, their economic clubs, their Rotary clubs, the Civitan club, all of them. I went. I enjoyed being on the Michigan Supreme Court. 7 of us. The Chief Justice was G. Menon Williams. The former Lieutenant Governor of the state, Jim Brickley, and others. Democrats, Republicans, and 1 independent, Charles Levin. You might wonder, or might have ever wondered in your life reading about the Supreme Court of Michigan, whether or not politics ever entered into their decisions. Politics entered into who got elected by the people of the state of Michigan, but it never entered the conference room when we discussed cases that came before us that were either argued or we considered to either affirm, reverse, or to just let stand. The Supreme Court reviews over 3,000 cases every year to make a determination whether the law should be changed, modified, if something needs to be more crisp, etc. It was a privilege to serve on that court. But while I was serving on that court, my office was in downtown Detroit. We lived in Palmer Woods in the city of Detroit, Woodward and 7 area. And on my way to work, I would see buildings that used to be, but they're now vacant or torn down. And depending upon where I might go for a speech or to do something, we would have, and I would see people or see what they've done in terms of depositing garbage, tires, everything out on a vacant lawn in the neighborhood. It looked bad. Kids were, as the press was writing about, were killing each other over jackets, gym shoes, designer glasses, etc. Businesses were leaving, had left the city of Detroit. Jobs were in demand. In 1990, the Census Department said that the city of Detroit led the nation with 32.2% of us living below poverty. And when you factored in the children, that meant 46.6% of the children lived below poverty. I decided in the middle of my 8-year term that I would resign to see whether or not, because I'd been encouraged to give some thought to being mayor of the city of Detroit. In the spring or summer of 1990, Michigan Lawyers Weekly, which is a publication that goes to lawyers and judges, did a first ever survey. And the survey was to find out what lawyers and judges thought who were the 20 most respected judges in the state of Michigan. And as it turned out, I not only made the 20, but I was the most respected judge in the state of Michigan. And so that really motivated people to motivate me or to suggest that I ought to consider being mayor. Now, please appreciate Mayor Young, by that time, would have been in office at the end of that term for 20 years. He'd done a phenomenal job early on in his administration. But as things occurred, we started losing jobs. He was disappointed that people left the city, wouldn't come back. The city of Detroit lost its last department store, J.L. Hudson, in about 1982-83 in downtown, and a lot of the businesses and shopping moved out of the city. Detroit was the first city in the United States to experience having a mall being built next to it or near it in the suburban community, Northland. There was Northland, Eastland, Southland, Westland. You could go to the malls, park your car free, go in, shop till you drop, all kind of restaurants, etc. In the meantime, city leaders raised parking downtown. They would have downtown dollar days in an effort to try to bring people back, but it was not successful. When Mayor Young first started in office, we had 16 automobile companies or plants in the city of Detroit. When he left, there were 3. He had all kinds of issues, not his own doing. And he was very fiscally responsible in terms of trying to keep the city above board. Mayor Jerome Kavanaugh, for example, I think was the first mayor who asked for the opportunity to impose income taxes, especially as it relates to people who lived outside the city but worked in the city of Detroit. Mayor Young had to use that as well because we were losing and lost population. Those of you familiar with cities, counties, townships, etc., you know that the way counties, cities, etc., provide city services is from 2 real big sources of income. One is property tax and the other is income tax. Detroit had a population in 1952-53 of 1.82 million people. In 1990, the census said the city of Detroit had 1,027,000 people. You can't lose over 8 million people no longer using and needing the same housing, the same buildings. Businesses had moved out. It took people 2 or 3 buses to try to follow their jobs out in the suburban communities. The city had its problems. The mayor went to the bond market the last time to balance the budget. Went to the bond market, and as a result, the bond market considered the bonds that Detroit offered for sale to build new buildings and try to keep the city moving, junk status. In fact, the city had to buy insurance so that people would be encouraged to buy the bonds. In December 1990, on December 18th, I announced that I was resigning from the Michigan Supreme Court. I left that press conference, went to the University of Michigan, and sat down with President Jim Duderstadt. And I said, Mr. President, I can't promise you that I'm going to run for mayor, but I do need help because if I run for mayor, I've got to take on a living legend, someone who is very well respected by the community, by the voters of our city. And so I will need somebody willing to help me find solutions to the problems we face. He said, I'll get back to you. He got back to me before the end of the month, and that was wonderful because when I announced I was resigning, my last day was December 28th of 1990. On January 1, I became a partner in Dickinson Wright, Moon, Van Dusen, and Freeman, now known as Dickinson Wright. I started in February meeting at Phil Powers' newspaper office headquarters. We brought in people who had similar problems that we were facing in the city of Detroit, and they'd solved them for their cities. I brought into the meetings the people from the city of Detroit on each of those issues whose opinions they had and they wanted to see change. And I figured if we're going to do anything to create a better life for the people living in the city of Detroit, we needed the best solutions and the best ideas possible. And so I brought them together. And we didn't spend time talking about the problems. We spent time talking about the solutions. We finished all of the meetings about the end of May, and then we began to write. And what we wrote was about a 56, 58-page document called Thoughts for a Greater Detroit. I sent out that document to over 1,000 people, including Mayor Young, because I wanted Mayor Young or whoever might be so motivated to take on this position, maybe to step up and say they'd run. Because if they did, I'd be able to stay at Dickinson Wright. I enjoyed myself, enjoyed the salaries, having a lot of fun trying cases and the like. But nobody stepped up. So I went out in the community. I first started meeting with the editorial boards of the News, Free Press, Michigan Chronicle, and others, trying to answer whatever questions that they had. And then I started going first to homes where people would open up their living room or down in their basement or rec room or whatever. And then I broadened it out as crowds got bigger or people wanted to know more, wanted to see what this person was talking about. Went to college campuses and had town hall meetings, went to churches, went everywhere I could go to say, I want to know what you think. I'm not coming to tell you I'm running and here's why you ought to support me. I want to know what you think. What is it will cause you to feel good about living in this city? What are you willing to do to make a change in this city? How can we all work this together? Well, I announced my candidacy in November of 1992, and with the help of over 6,000 volunteers, and we raised about $3.4 million in the process. I was fortunate enough to be elected in November of 1993. We had great plans. Everything, all the ideas were how we were going to fund it, what the city might be able to do to make this happen. And then Jay Alex, who was my finance chair on the transition team, went over to see the budget director, who was Ed Rago at the time, very brilliant guy. But he found out that despite the fact that they'd been to the bond market a few years ago, and we still owed over, I think, $100 million to repay those bonds, the city of Detroit was going to have a deficit of $88.5 million. That's what I was going to inherit. Ed Rago, at the request of Jay Alex, made it known to the public that the city of Detroit was facing a deficit of $88.5 million. That was going to be something I had to solve. We solved those problems. I was sworn in at the very beginning of January 1994. My first day on the job, I spent working with and listening to our budget director and the finance director of the city. I wanted to know, how is it that after the budget was balanced, we wind up with an $88.5 million deficit? What was it that caused us to do that? I learned a lot that day. But then we had that week. That week, I'd been out to, was it Boulder, Colorado? I think was where I went, to encourage the World Figure Skating folks to come to Detroit to have their championship, skating championship. So I went over to the arena, Joe Louis, to welcome everybody to the city of Detroit. Thank you for being here. We're looking forward to the great competition. The whole world is going to be focused on you, and I hope that you'll enjoy yourself here in the city. I went back to my office, and within a matter of hours or a day or so, I get a telephone call from my new chief of police. Ike McKinnon calls and said, Mr. Mayor, we got a problem. What's the problem? Nancy Kerrigan, who was expected to win it all, she has been assaulted. Now, because I practiced some criminal law in my lifetime, I'm thinking a different kind of assault, and I'm saying, gee whiz, I wasn't happy that she had her knee hit, but I was glad she had her knee hit rather than some other kind of assault, if you understand what I'm saying. And so every eye seemed like it was on the city of Detroit. Every national news station wanted to know what happened to Nancy Kerrigan, who caused this to happen, how did it, who was it, etc. Every day, Ike was on being interviewed, I was on being interviewed, and his number two, Benny Napoleon, got a telephone call in the middle of the night. Somebody from the police department called and said, Benny, somebody wants to talk to you, but they only talk to you. That person told Benny who hit her and where that person was. I can't tell you how happy I was to have that case solved so quickly. But that was not the end of the week. On Friday, I go to the Detroit Economic Club, 1,500 people there. It's the day before the largest charity in the city of Detroit. It was to open up the doors for the International Auto Show so that the public can come in, paying money, of course. And they were raising millions of dollars for children's charities. I'm getting ready to go up to the microphone to speak. One of my staff members, Julie McNally, comes up to me and said, Mr. Mayor, we got a problem. I said, okay, what's the problem? We need to go talk to DTE because the power is out that has caused, there's no heat in the building in Cobo Hall where ladies are going to be coming in their gowns, etc. Guys are going to be there in tuxedos. And in some of the hotels where people are staying, there's no hot water. We got a problem. So I get before the microphone. Thank you all for coming. Glad you're here. I hope you enjoy the auto show. But as you know, being mayor, you get things you got to do. Thank you so much for coming, but please excuse me. I went to find out how we could solve the problem. We solved the problem. The thing went okay, and it was just a sheer delight. I will tell you, after that first week, I might have been talking to myself a little bit. How in the world could you left the Supreme Court, you bigged them, how come I'm telling you, you start going through all kind of thoughts, and then you say, but that's why you were elected, to solve these problems. I put a smile on my face and kept moving. The first month in office, I become good friends with President Bill Clinton because his wife and I were active in the American Bar Association together. She was busy chairing the Commission on Women knocking down glass ceilings. I was busy chairing a committee for opportunities for minorities in the profession, trying to open up doors for those of us of color. She and I became very good friends, traveled the country. She's knocking down ceilings, I'm trying to open up doors. Had a chance because then Bill Clinton said he was going to run. I said I'd help him because Governor Jim Blanchard, Bill Clinton were very good friends. I liked him. I said I'd help. He got elected. I ran. I got elected. I get a call the night that I won the election. It was Bill Clinton congratulating me and like to talk to Trudy. And then later that week, I got a telephone call from the president's office saying, President would like to know if you'd like to spend the night at the White House. You're coming down for the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting. Maybe you'd like to spend the night. I said, yes, I would. Thank you very much. I go to, but I don't tell anybody. I didn't even tell my wife. Now, here's what I want you to appreciate my thought. Now, if something happens where the president, for some other reason, gets called off to do something and he's not going to be there, and maybe they call and say, you know, we'll have to put this off another time, etc. How do you explain that if you tell the press or people? Well, see, now I went there and I was going to go, but then I was called and said that, and then folks started looking at you. Oh, yeah, you were really invited, huh? Yeah, oh, it's going to be like, oh, so I didn't say anything. I got to the White House that night, called my wife and said, I'm in the Lincoln bedroom. Had a chance to visit with the president later that night. Got up in the morning, went to breakfast, came back, got my bag, trying to find my way out of the White House, couldn't do it, so I went back to Lincoln bedroom and said, this is Dennis Archer, mayor of Detroit. Could you send somebody up to show me out how to get out of here? And they said yes, and I said, maybe I better hurry up because maybe they might go through my bag. So I took out the robe that I put in the bag and I took it. No, but I did take some napkins. But in any event, it was really special. I'm at a bar meeting, American Bar Association meeting, Nashville, Tennessee. I get a telephone call. It was a beeper. Let me tell you something. I left Dickinson Wright. We had computers, we had cell phones, we had emails, we had all kind of ways to communicate. I go across the street, we're using rotary dial telephones. We had no computers. We didn't have one stitch, not one letter in any drawer to give you a guide on what to expect, etc. In any event, I got a beeper on now. I'm in Tennessee at an ABA mid-year meeting. I get a beeper goes off, call the office. I call the office. They said, call the White House. Here's the number. I call the White House. Congratulations, Mr. Mayor. President Clinton has chosen Detroit to have the G7 jobs conference in your city. When's it going to happen? In March. Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much. Do I need to go back to Detroit now? Oh, no, we're talking to your deputy mayor, and we'll have things underway. Thank you very much. I get off the phone. I call the deputy mayor and say, what the heck is a G7 jobs conference? Learned about it real quick. We had to raise, and did raise $1.4 million to have them come to the city of Detroit. We changed a room in Cobo Hall where you had simultaneous translations, and I had the booths enclosed, and the people who were at the table from the various countries could communicate. We set it up so that they could have their home newspapers delivered to them, the favorite foods that they would likely eat from their countries. We had it for them and the like. We were off and running. And it was really something wonderful to happen. Detroit was never considered for an empowerment zone. It was something that had come up with the Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin, Henry Cisneros, who was the Cabinet Secretary of HUD, and several others. They decided, because they met with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, that they wanted to give cities a hand up, not a handout. So they created this concept that if you won the empowerment zone, you would be given $100 million over 10 years to be able to provide programs that the cities would lay out as an agenda that they could use to help their citizens. Nobody gave us a prayer. In fact, Ed McNamara, who was a county executive, was starting a move to develop an empowerment zone presentation because Mayor Young, by that time, was not running, and decided he wasn't going to run, didn't put anybody in charge. And Ed McNamara was going to do Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park because all three cities are within Wayne County. I came in and found that the person that he was using to help him do that was a former law partner, his wife. Her name was Gloria Robinson. And we found out, as we searched around the United States, who's some of the brightest city planners, community developers, etc. And she was already in our city and was working for Ed. I went to her and said, I want you to come and run 2 of my departments, and I want you to run the empowerment zone. She left, came there. They worked together like Trojans, everybody working long, late hours. Nobody gave us a prayer. I went to Brenda Snyder, who is a senior vice president at Comerica Bank, and I said, I need you to be on this effort. I need you to work with the banks. I need you to make sure that you all give me a commitment that you will loan businesses in the empowerment zone the largest amount that you all can do over 10 years. She came back very close to being towards the end and said, I've got $500,000 or $500 million that we can loan. I said, that won't be good enough. Everything I read, nobody believes we're going to be able to do anything anyway, but if we have the best application, I believe we can win this thing. She went back. The banks came up with $1 billion. The automotives came up with $600 million that they would invest in new buildings, etc., new manufacturing places over 10 years. And others who were lawyers, accountants, etc., said we will give discounts to businesses that would move in the empowerment zone. When we put that package together, we had a package of $1.92 billion. But it's still, I thought we were missing something. I went to Peter Schweitzer, whom I met. He was head of one of the most powerful advertising companies in the world. In fact, he had been asked to come lead it nationally, and he said he'd rather stay in Detroit. And so I went to him. I said, I have no money. He said, we'll do it pro bono. On December 21st, 1994, the president and the vice president were going to announce the winners. Detroit won. Governor Engler, who understood what that meant and what that could do for Detroit, also decided that he would come up with what was called Renaissance zones. We could get money from the state would come in and clean up if there was any environmental problems anywhere. Bob, I hate to call you out. Would you stand up for a minute? Bob was with the EPA out of Chicago. They had a little contentious kind of situation with Mayor Young. But Ms. Browner, who was the EPA administrator, and Bob and his staff out of Chicago, when we got in, they worked with us, taught us what we needed to do, etc. We were able to have Renaissance zones in the city of Detroit. Between those two things, when we had the 2000 census, there were 15 other cities that had a higher level of poverty than the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit led the nation 3 or 4 years in a row, being named by Site Selection magazine as the city in the area that caused more jobs to be created, more businesses to be created, etc. Businesses had to go to 3 or 4 different buildings to get one permit. We brought in volunteers from business to come in and help us narrow it down to one building so we can make jobs and permits easier. The $88.5 million that we inherited, we balanced that budget. Every year that I was in office on my own budget, we balanced the budget every year. We had a modest rainy day fund, a modest surplus, and during that 8 years that I was in office, the newspapers wrote that our pension funds, police, fire in general, were overfunded by $921 million. People worked their hearts out because they believed in the city. Citizens came together to help clean up the city of Detroit. First year in office, we had 7,500 people. We had folks coming in, elected officials, sending in equipment. So judges from other counties came in. And in my last year, we had over 50,000 people doing the same thing over a weekend to make a difference. In March, after we received the empowerment zone designation, right after the first of the year, from the media, well, Mr. Mayor, you've had the empowerment zone now. When are we gonna see something here? What are you gonna do? What's happening here? In March, from Argentina, I got a call from Bob Eaton, who is the CEO of Chrysler. He called and said, Mr. Mayor, how would you like to have a plant in your empowerment zone that will be the equivalent of $750 million investment? I just simply said, yes! And so he called back another time later, another plant. And then everybody started investing in the city of Detroit, both in the Renaissance zones and in the empowerment zones. General Motors tore down their Cadillac, old Fleetwood Cadillac plant, because they had a new one that was built, leveled it, and we attracted new businesses, new jobs. Bill Picard and Vitec, Ron Hall with Bridgewater, the Hispanic Manufacturing Center with Frank Venegas, Frank Gonzalez, and another person, an outstanding woman. New jobs. We went and utilized the jobs, the COPS program that was implemented by President Clinton. Every time we could hire a new officer on that program, you had to commit. They would, in effect, over 3 years, pay half their salary over 3 years. But you had to commit that you wouldn't lay them off once they stopped paying. And we made that commitment. We reduced crime every year in the city of Detroit. We reduced fatal fires. We had 33 new playgrounds that were put together by Bill Davison, who owned the Detroit Pistons and Guardian Industries. There were the new businesses that were attracted to help create new parks, $12 million worth. And they created a $1 million endowment to replace backboards, swings, or whatever the case may be. We had new housing. We had 2 new stadiums, Comerica Park, Ilitch Family, Ford Field, William Clay Ford. 3 new casinos. The temporaries were built while I was in office. Bond ratings, which were junk bond ratings when I came into office. We had an A+ with Standard & Poor's, A with Fitch, and we were at a B+ or something with Moody's. Moody's the first one to put you down, last one to build your bond rating back up, but we were very happy. We had a balanced budget, I said, every year. I will tell you this, borrow somebody's book if you like, but if you look in the back, there's nothing like always wanting to have the facts, right? And so if you look in the back, you will find an appendix. And in that appendix, you will see a chart that was put together by Brenda Snyder that recorded every one of the investments made by businesses already built, completed, announced, or in the process of being made. $20.2 billion of new investment. Trudy would tell you I spent 16, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, because you just can't go to church and ask for them to vote, because they're going to turn right around and say, well, you know, we got this Men's Day program. We'd like for you to, yes, sir, what time would you? I was all over. When I first got in office, if somebody was starting a business that was in a telephone booth, and there was going to be 2 people there, I had a press conference saying how important that was to the city. I wanted to make sure that everybody knew how important jobs were and that we all need to work together. I also wanted to reach out to our entire suburban community in outstate Michigan, because when the issue was on the ballot as to whether or not the city of Detroit should receive the privilege of having up to 3 privately owned casinos. It was a statewide ballot. I wanted people, I didn't know that was going to happen, but I wanted people to know what we would do and how we would do it. And that passed on a statewide ballot. I term limited myself after 8 years. I wanted to do some other things. I wanted to be president of the American Bar Association. American Bar Association, interesting history. When they were first formed, and for the longest period of time, there was not one person of color that they would let be a member. In 1943, they finally stopped having an application that you had to fill out, that you had to list your ethnicity. And if they didn't recognize your name, somebody at the American Bar would come to that office and look at you to make sure that you were not a person of color. I wanted to become president. I hope to be able to set an example for others to follow and to cause the American Bar Association to look at us differently and positively, and they did. And it has been very, very helpful across the board. I also wanted to serve on publicly traded companies. I saw what Vernon Jordan did right after he left the national president of Urban League. He went to work for a major law firm, but he wound up serving at the time on up to 11 corporate boards at the same time, publicly traded. While there, he would continue to open up doors for equal opportunity for women and men. So I wanted to serve on publicly traded boards. I was privileged to serve on Johnson Controls, CompuWare, Masco, and now TopBuild. And I was recently elected to serve on a for-profit corporation called Alex Partners. I have watched what foundations could do. Thanks to David Smidra, you read about him in the book for those who buy it or read it or borrow it from somebody else. He came to me through the Dayton Hudson Foundation. They called me and said, "We know how much respect you have for foundations. If you will let this person report directly to you, we will pay this person's salary." I said, "Fine, you got it." He raised over the 8 years that we were in office and we worked together over $500 million. I don't think any city in the United States has been able to top that. With all that we find ourselves in today's world, there's a lot that we might find to complain about with some legitimacy. But Trudy and I, when I was mayor, we traveled in a lot of different countries trying to bring new business back, not just to Detroit, but to Detroit region. And we were successful doing that. And then when I was president of the American Bar Association, we traveled to Moscow to meet with lawyers because President Putin finally agreed to let them have jury trials, and they never really had much experience with it, so they invited me to come over. I went to the opening of the Inns and Court in London, where folks were at a top hat and tails, and went to Lisbon, Portugal for the International Bar Association meeting, and then back to San Francisco to meet with another International Bar Association. And we've been to Paris. We've been to Abuja, Nigeria, Nairobi, Kenya. And it has been a real learning experience. But I will tell you this, with all of its history that I've lived through, I've read about, I've seen, I've participated in, with all the current issues that we have before us today, there is no other country that I would rather be a resident of, and there's no other country I would rather be a member of, and that is the United States of America. I'm proud of our country, and I'm proud of all of you and what you do to bring speakers better than me, but to come out and share information and ideas so that you can walk away and make lives different for your grandchildren, for the children that live here, to improve whatever it is that your outreach happens to be. Thank you for the invitation. I'm ready for questions.